They cut down my trees, so I cut off their only road. I had always loved the mornings on my property, the way the sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of oaks, casting golden patterns on the grass, the smell of fresh earth and dew, the quiet that made you feel like the world existed only here. These trees were more than just part of the landscape. They were guardians of my home, a natural barrier between me and the world beyond my land. Some of them had stood for decades, weathering storms and harsh winters, their branches stretching proudly toward the sky. I could remember climbing some of them as a kid, scraping my knees, feeling alive in a way no modern convenience could replicate. They were my history, my connection to the generations who had walked this land before me, and the only thing keeping the intrusive world at bay. I didn't notice the first signs of trouble at first. It was subtle, cars driving a little too, slowly up the ridge, glances through binoculars, muffled whispers from behind the white fences of the HOA homes above me. I thought nothing of it at first. People are naturally curious, and my property was visible from the road that cut across the hill. But then the notes started appearing. Formal letters from the HOA slipped under my gate, perfectly typed, explaining that the natural beauty of the neighborhood was being obstructed by trees on my land. I laughed the first time I read, on obstructed? My trees weren't obstructing anything. They were standing tall, serene, majestic. But the letters kept coming, polite at first, then passive-aggressive, then outright demanding. I tried to reason with them. I sent polite replies explaining that my trees were on my property and that I had no intention of removing them. I offered compromise. Perhaps I could trim certain branches, shape the canopy, even plant flowers along the perimeter. But nothing seemed to satisfy them. And that was when Karen arrived. Karen Cartwright, HOA president, self-appointed arbiter of scenic perfection, and the embodiment of entitlement. I had met her once at a neighborhood meeting years ago. Perfect hair, pristine white blouse, heels clicking against polished floors, clipboard in hand. She had smiled then, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and made it clear she knew exactly who was in charge. At the time, I had dismissed it, assuming HOA politics were a world apart from the quiet life I had chosen here. I was wrong. The day it happened, I was on the porch, sipping coffee, enjoying the crisp morning air. And then I heard it, the unmistakable roar of chainsaws. At first, I thought it might be a distant crew cutting down storm-damaged trees somewhere along the road, but the sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. My heart dropped. I ran down the gravel path and froze. My oldest oaks, the ones I had climbed as a boy, were being reduced to stumps. Workers moved efficiently, chainsaws biting through the trunks like they were nothing, while Karen stood nearby, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the picture of satisfaction. I stared at her. She didn't flinch, didn't even seem aware of the outrage in my expression. "Morning?" she called brightly, as if the morning had nothing to do with the destruction she was orchestrating. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I couldn't speak. At first, my trees, my sanctuary, gone. "Why are my trees on the ground?" I finally managed, my voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Oh, those," Karen said casually, tilting her head, like I had asked something absurd. "They were blocking the view." I blinked. My view? I looked around. The ridge above my land, the row of luxury homes gleaming in the sun. Yes, they could see my property now. My home, my barn, everything that was mine, laid bare for their eyes. My trees hadn't just blocked a view. They had shielded me from the overreach of people like her, from the intrusive gaze of the entitled. "You cut down trees on my property," I said slowly, letting each word land. Karen gave a soft sigh, almost like she was disappointed I didn't understand the situation. "They were dead anyway," she said, flipping open her clipboard as if that excused everything. I walked over to the nearest stump and ran my hand across the freshly cut wood. The yellow core gleamed in the sunlight, healthy, solid, alive, not dead. Not even close. And in that moment, standing among the stumps, looking at the destruction that had been done without consent, without warning, I realized something important. Karen didn't just want a view. She wanted control. She wanted to assert dominance over me, over my land, over the very life I had built. My trees had protected me for decades, and now they were gone. But I wasn't finished. I took a deep breath and let the anger settle into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just a violation of property. It was a declaration of war, and I was already thinking about how to fight back. The next morning, I thought I had prepared myself for what I would see, but nothing could have braced me for the reality. The sound of chainsaws had returned before sunrise, low and menacing, like a warning rather than work. I threw on my boots and ran out the back door, heart hammering, and there they were, 3 men in orange safety vests, cutting down the last of my maple trees along the property line. Branches cracked and splintered like glass, and the smell of sawdust mixed with sap filled the crisp morning air. I froze for a second, stomach twisting, realizing they were moving faster than I could stop them. And then Karen appeared, striding down the slope with her clipboard and sunglasses, the morning sun reflecting off the lenses. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel, but she didn't stumble. Not once. She had that same infuriating smile she always wore, the one that could make you want to punch a wall. "Good morning," she called cheerfully, like she was greeting a friend rather than trespassing on someone's land with the audacity of a conqueror. "Looks like we're making great progress." I couldn't believe it. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "Stop. Stop right now. These trees are mine." Karen glanced at me casually, flipping through her clipboard as if I were an annoying fly buzzing in her field of vision. "Technically," she said, "these trees were interfering with the scenic view of the community. We're just helping preserve it." I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. Helping preserve it? They were part of my property. They were alive. And they're not yours to take. She tilted her head, pretending to consider my words, and then waved toward the workers. "Carry on. They'll be done by lunch." It was surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. The chainsaws roared louder, carving through the trunks with terrifying efficiency. I stepped forward, trying to intervene, but the workers stepped back, hands raised as if they weren't part of the crime. They were just following orders. And in a way, I understood that too. But Karen wasn't just giving orders. She was enjoying this. Every glance she threw at me was filled with smug satisfaction, as if my distress was some sort of entertainment. I tried reasoning one more time. "Karen, look at these trees. They're alive, healthy. You can't just cut them down." Her sunglasses glinted in the sun. Alive? They were blocking progress. And really, it's for the good of everyone. Everyone deserves a perfect view. Her voice was light, casual, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. She didn't care about legality, decency, or human decency. This was a power move, a declaration that she could do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, and that I had no authority here. By the time the last tree fell, I was shaking, not from the cold, but from the surge of helpless fury coursing through me. I looked at the empty space where a majestic maple had stood the day before, its absence a gaping wound in my land. And then I noticed Karen scribbling something on her clipboard, apparently unconcerned that she had just destroyed decades of growth and history. "You'll get over it," she said, catching my gaze and smiling. "Trees grow back, don't they?" I swallowed hard. "Not in time. Not like this. Not the way they were." Karen shrugged, flipping the page as if I hadn't spoken. "Progress requires sacrifice. You'll understand someday." And that was the moment I realized there was no reasoning with her. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a petty dispute. This was deliberate. She had chosen to cross a line, to assert dominance over me, over my home, over the life I had built. It was betrayal in the purest form, and it cut deeper than the chainsaws had cut into my trees. I stepped closer to Karen, my voice low, but deadly calm. "You've made a huge mistake," she laughed, a high, sharp sound that grated against my nerves. "Oh, I doubt that. In fact, I think you'll thank me eventually." I shook my head. I turned away, staring at the stumps, imagining the hollow silence that would follow. And in that silence, a seed of something powerful began to grow. Anger, yes, but also strategy. I wasn't going to be the victim. Not of Karen, not of her HOA, not of anyone. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I would cower, plead, or accept the destruction as inevitable. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. Because I had something. They didn't, a plan. After the chainsaws fell silent, the yard smelling of sawdust and sap, I retreated inside and slammed the door behind me. The calm of my home contrasted sharply with the chaos outside, but my mind was racing. I couldn't just react. Karen and her HOA had overstepped in every possible way, cutting down trees that had stood for decades, trespassing, and doing it all with a smug smile like I was beneath consideration. Anger surged, but alongside it was clarity. They had assumed power over me without ever checking the rules, without ever considering that there might be something in my favor, and that assumption was about to become their downfall. I pulled out the filing cabinet in the corner of my office. My grandfather had been obsessive about keeping every deed, every easement, every permit in meticulous order. When I opened the drawers, the smell of old paper and ink reminded me of the years of care my family had poured into this land. I sifted through folder after folder until I found it. The easement agreement for the Ridge Road. The paper was yellowed at the edges. Signatures faded but legible. I scanned the document quickly, my pulse quickening as I realized just what it contained. The HOA had been granted access to the road that ran along my property, a road that led directly up to their luxury homes on the ridge. That road was their lifeline, the only way in and out of the neighborhood without detouring miles around the valley. But buried deep in the language of the document, almost easy to miss, was a conditional clause. Access could be revoked if the benefiting party, the HOA, caused deliberate damage to the landowner's property. My blood ran cold with anticipation. That was all I needed. The chainsaws, the stumps, the destruction of my trees. Karen hadn't just acted recklessly, she had given me the perfect reason to legally cut off their access entirely. I leaned back in my chair and let the idea settle. I could already see the scene forming in my mind. Karen's perfect hair, her designer heels, her smug expression, shattered. The neighborhood residents, panicked and confused as they realized the road they relied on daily was no longer theirs to use. It was poetic justice, a punishment befitting the audacity of someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. Before acting, I had to be sure. I picked up the phone and called the County Property Records Division, speaking to a clerk who patiently guided me through the details. I asked about easements, access rights, and the conditions under which revocation was allowed. Each answer confirmed my suspicions. They didn't just allow me to block the road, they legally required me to protect my property from harm. Karen and her HOA had destroyed property. That gave me all the authority I needed. I hung up the phone, feeling a thrill of vindication mixed with cold calculation. The chainsaw betrayal had been their first mistake. Their second would be far worse. I started planning the logistics. A sturdy gate, reinforced posts, clear signage. It needed to be undeniable, impossible to bypass, and entirely compliant with the law. This wasn't going to be an impulsive act of revenge. It would be precise, deliberate, and humiliating in its perfection. While Karen thought she had won by removing the trees, she had no idea that she had triggered a chain reaction. The removal of 7 majestic trees had been reckless, short-sighted, and arrogant. They hadn't just destroyed my property, they had handed me the key to their downfall. I studied the property lines, measuring distances, imagining the perfect placement for the gate. I considered cameras to capture the inevitable confrontation. Every detail mattered. Every moment of anticipation would increase the impact of the reveal. And then, as I stared out the window at the empty stump swaying slightly in the morning breeze, I felt something else. Satisfaction. The knowledge that justice, when carefully executed, could be far more devastating than anger. Karen had relied on fear and intimidation to get what she wanted. She had assumed I would be passive, that I would negotiate, that I would eventually comply. But she had underestimated me. The legal loophole wasn't just a tool, it was leverage, and I intended to use it fully. By the end of the day, my plan was clear. The chainsaw betrayal had been their first strike, their declaration of war. My response would be total, irreversible, and perfectly within my rights. Karen had thought she was untouchable. She had thought her power extended over my land, my trees, my life. Soon, she would learn that arrogance has consequences, and that the very rules she sought to bend could become the instruments of her humiliation. I would wait for the right moment, strike decisively, and watch as the empire she built on entitlement began to crumble. The morning I decided to act, the air felt electric, thick with anticipation. I woke before dawn, as usual, but today, my movements were different. Every step I took was deliberate, precise, filled with a kind of satisfaction that only comes when you know you are about to deliver justice. I had spent the past days gathering supplies, calculating angles, and ensuring everything was within the boundaries of the law. A sturdy steel gate, reinforced posts sunk deep into the ground, and clear signage proclaiming the revocation of access, all ready. The chainsaw betrayal had been their first mistake, and this would be my answer, calculated to the smallest detail. By 7:30 a.m., the gate was installed across the narrow dirt road that ran along my property. Its metal glinted in the morning sun, solid, imposing, impossible to bypass. A sign hung from the middle, bold letters declaring, "Access revoked due to deliberate property damage by benefiting party." I stepped back and surveyed the scene, the stumps of my oak trees in the background like silent witnesses. Everything was perfect. At exactly 7:50 a.m., the first car appeared at the base of the ridge. A minivan, followed by a line of SUVs and sedans, all carrying residents who had assumed the road was theirs without question. They slowed as they approached the gate, confusion spreading across their faces. I could see them muttering to each other, peering through the windshields, trying to figure out what was happening. And then Karen arrived. She had likely left her house expecting nothing more than a normal morning, perhaps unaware that her empire of entitlement had already begun to unravel. Her black SUV screeched slightly on the gravel as she pulled up behind the halted line of cars. Her sunglasses reflected the sun, but I could see the tension in the way she held herself, shoulders stiff, hands gripping the wheel. The perfect smile was gone. In its place was irritation, disbelief, and the first hint of fear. Karen stepped out of the SUV, clipboard in hand, and called out, "What is this?" Her voice was sharp now, no longer casual or cheerful. "You can't block this road." I leaned against my tractor, arms crossed, my voice calm and deliberate. "Actually, I can. The easement access has been revoked." She blinked, scanning the sign as if it were some trick of the light. Then she caught my eye. "You're bluffing. This isn't legal." I smiled faintly. "Oh, it's legal. I checked every detail. County records, easement agreements, property documents. Every condition has been met. Your property damage, your destruction of my trees gave me the authority. You've crossed a line you didn't even know existed." The residents behind her had started getting out of their cars, murmuring, pointing, panic spreading like wildfire. "What does this mean?" one shouted. "How are we supposed to get to the highway?" Another pounded on the hood of their car, frustration turning to anger. The chaos was mounting, a living, breathing response to Karen's arrogance. Karen's attempts to regain control grew frantic. "Everyone, stay calm. This is temporary. This is just a misunderstanding." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her. I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She hadn't considered the consequences. She had believed that her power and position would shield her from any fallout. But the law didn't care about titles, status, or designer sunglasses. The law, and in this case logic and justice, was on my side. I watched as the line of cars grew longer, residents honking, shouting, phones in hand as they called neighbors or tried to find alternate routes. Karen's voice rose above the din, a mix of commands and pleas, but it was too late. Her neighborhood, perched on the ridge, suddenly felt isolated, trapped. Every moment that passed, her authority eroded further. The power she had wielded so confidently was slipping through her fingers, and through it all, I remained calm. I didn't yell. I didn't act rashly. I stood there, silent, letting the situation unfold. Every shout, every exclamation, every frantic glance from Karen was a testament to her hubris, a mirror reflecting the arrogance that had led her to cut down my trees in the first place. By the time I walked over to the gate and tightened the last bolt, the residents had begun realizing that there was no bypass, no alternative road for miles. Panic and confusion had set in, and Karen's desperation was palpable. I stepped back and watched, letting them absorb the full impact of their predicament. The chainsaw betrayal was avenged, not with violence, not with threats, but with precise, undeniable authority. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt complete satisfaction. Justice had been served. Karen's attempt to assert dominance, to take what was never hers, had backfired spectacularly, and I knew deep down that the best was yet to come. By late morning, the chaos on the ridge had reached its peak. Cars lined the narrow road like trapped animals, residents climbing out and pacing, gesturing, shouting into their phones. Karen stood at the front of the crowd, clipboard now abandoned on the